Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she bent over the complex radio equipment spread across her workbench. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows of the small electronics repair shop she had inherited from her grandfather 3 years ago. At 28, she had become one of the most skilled radio technicians in the coastal town of Coronado, California, though most people walking by her shop had no idea of her extraordinary background. The radio crackling on her bench was a military-grade communication device, far more sophisticated than the usual car stereos and home entertainment systems that filled her daily repair queue. She had been working on it since dawn, carefully tracing circuits and testing components, with the precision that had been drilled into her during her 8 years of military service. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she identified a faulty capacitor in the radio's transmitter circuit. Most technicians would have given up hours ago, declaring the unit beyond repair. But Sarah wasn't most technicians. She had learned her craft in some of the most demanding conditions imaginable, where a malfunctioning radio could mean the difference between life and death for an entire unit. The bell above her shop door chimed, and Sarah glanced up to see a customer entering. He was tall, with the kind of confident posture that immediately suggested military training. His civilian clothes couldn't hide the alertness in his eyes or the way he automatically scanned the room upon entering. Sarah had seen that look countless times before. "Can I help you?" she asked, setting down her soldering iron and turning to face the visitor. The man approached her counter, his gaze taking in the various pieces of equipment scattered around the shop. His eyes lingered on the military radio she had been repairing, and Sarah noticed a flicker of recognition cross his features. "I heard you might be able to fix this," he said, placing a small tactical communication device on her counter. "It took some water damage during a training exercise last week." Sarah picked up the device, immediately recognizing it as a specialized unit used by Special Operations Forces. Her fingers found the battery, compartment and inspection ports with the familiarity of someone who had worked with similar equipment many times before. "Water damage can be tricky with these units," she said, opening the device to examine the internal components. "The circuits are pretty sensitive, but if we caught it early enough, there's a good chance I can save it." The man watched her work with increasing interest. There was something about the way she handled the tactical radio that seemed familiar to him, though he couldn't quite place it. "You seem to know your way around military equipment," he observed. Sarah paused for just a moment before responding. "I've worked on a few pieces like this before. Electronics are electronics, whether they're military or civilian." It was a carefully neutral answer, one she had perfected over the years. Most people didn't need to know about her background, and she had learned that revealing too much often led to uncomfortable questions or unwanted attention. The customer introduced himself as Mike Thompson and explained that he worked at the nearby naval base. He seemed genuinely impressed by her technical knowledge and asked if she might be available for some additional repair work. "We have some older communication equipment that needs attention," he said. "The usual contractors want to replace everything, but some of these units just need the right person who knows how to fix them properly." Sarah considered the offer. The extra work would certainly help her business, and she did miss working with the more sophisticated equipment that had once been a daily part of her life. "I'd be interested," she said. "When would you need me to take a look at it?" Mike smiled and handed her a business card. "How about tomorrow morning? I can arrange for you to come on base and assess what we're dealing with." After he left, Sarah returned to her workbench, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation. It had been 3 years since she had left the military. 3 years since she had walked away from a career that had defined her entire adult life. She had built a quiet, peaceful existence in Coronado, far removed from the intensity and danger of her previous work. But as she looked at the military radio on her bench, she felt a familiar stirring of excitement. These devices represented more than just technical challenges. They were lifelines for the men and women who depended on them in critical situations. Sarah had always been drawn to fixing things, even as a child. While other kids played with dolls or video games, she had spent hours in her grandfather's workshop, learning to repair radios and electronic devices. When she joined the military at 18, it seemed like a natural fit. What she hadn't expected was how far that path would take her, or the secrets she would carry long after she returned to civilian life. As the afternoon sun began to set, Sarah cleaned up her workbench and prepared to close the shop. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she had a feeling that accepting Mike's offer might change her quiet life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the naval base gates with her toolkit and a visitor's badge that Mike had arranged for her. The familiar sights and sounds of military life washed over her as she drove through the entrance. The crisp uniforms, the purposeful movement of personnel, and the underlying sense of readiness brought back a flood of memories she had worked hard to bury. Mike met her at the communications building, a nondescript concrete structure that housed some of the base's most sensitive equipment. As they walked through the corridors, Sarah noticed the security measures and protocols that would be invisible to most civilian contractors. Her trained eye automatically cataloged exit routes, security cameras, and the subtle signs that indicated they were entering increasingly classified areas. Most of our equipment is pretty standard, Mike explained as he led her into a workshop area. But we have some older units that the regular maintenance crews can't seem to figure out. Sarah's breath caught as she entered the room. Spread across several workbenches were pieces of communication equipment that she recognized immediately. These weren't just any military radios. They were specialized units used by special operations forces, the kind of equipment she had worked with extensively during her time in the service. Where did these come from? She asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Various sources, Mike replied. Some are from decommissioned units, others came back from overseas operations. The problem is that a lot of the documentation has been lost or classified beyond our clearance level, so we're working blind on most repairs. Sarah approached one of the radios, a sophisticated digital communication system that she had helped design modifications for during her final years in the military. Her fingers traced the familiar controls and connections, and she could see immediately what was wrong with it. This one has a blown power regulator, she said, pointing to a specific circuit board. It's a common failure when the unit overheats. You'll need to replace this component here, and then recalibrate the frequency response. Mike stared at her with surprise. How did you figure that out so quickly? Our tech team has been working on that radio for 3 weeks. Sarah realized she had revealed too much of her expertise too quickly. She forced herself to slow down and think before responding. Like I said yesterday, electronics are electronics. Plus, this type of failure creates a pretty distinctive pattern once you know what to look for. She moved to the next radio, deliberately taking more time to examine it. But her trained eye quickly identified the problems with each piece of equipment. Years of experience had taught her to diagnose these systems almost instinctively. As she worked, Mike watched her with growing curiosity. There was something about her approach that reminded him of the military technicians he had worked with during his special operations training. She handled the equipment with the same careful precision, the same understanding of how these systems operated in life-or-death situations. Have you ever done any military work? He asked directly. Sarah paused in her examination of a tactical radio. This was the question she had been hoping to avoid, but she could see that Mike was too observant to be easily deflected. I spent some time in the service, she admitted, but that was a few years ago. Different life. What branch? Mike pressed. Army, Sarah replied, which was technically true, though it omitted the more complex details of her military career. Mike nodded, but she could see that he wasn't entirely satisfied with her vague answers. Military people had a way of recognizing each other, and she could tell he was picking up on signals she hadn't meant to send. They spent the next 2 hours going through the equipment, with Sarah providing detailed repair assessments for each piece. Her knowledge was comprehensive and precise, covering not just the technical aspects but also the tactical applications of each system. You really know this stuff, Mike said as they finished their review. I mean, really know it. Most civilian contractors can fix the basic functions, but you understand how these systems integrate with field operations. Sarah realized she had been too thorough in her explanations. Her knowledge went beyond simple repair work. She understood these radios as tools of warfare, as critical components in complex military operations. I've always been interested in how things work, she said, trying to downplay her expertise. When you fix something, it helps to understand what it's supposed to do. Mike was quiet for a moment, studying her with the kind of analytical gaze she remembered from her military days. She could practically see him putting pieces together in his mind. Sarah, he said finally, I think you might be exactly what we need for a special project we've been working on, but it would require a higher security clearance and some additional background checks. Sarah's heart began to race. She had worked so hard to build a simple, quiet life, away from the complications of classified work and special projects. But she also felt a familiar pull, the same attraction to challenging, meaningful work that had driven her military career. "What kind of project?" she asked, despite her better judgment. Mike looked around the workshop, then leaned closer to lower his voice. "We've recovered some equipment from overseas that nobody can figure out how to repair. It's not standard issue, if you know what I mean. Custom modifications, specialized applications, the kind of stuff that requires someone who really understands the field applications." Sarah knew she should say no, should thank him politely and return to her simple repair shop. But the technical challenge called to her, and she found herself nodding. "I'd be interested in taking a look," she said. As they left the communications building, Sarah wondered if she was making a mistake. She had left her old life behind for good reasons, and getting involved in classified projects again felt like stepping backward. But as they walked across the base, she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet civilian life was about to become much more complicated. 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself in a secure facility that required multiple levels of clearance to access. The background check had gone through faster than expected, which told her that her old military records had expedited the process. She tried not to think about what information might have been reviewed or who might have been contacted during the security screening. The room she entered looked more like a high-tech laboratory than a typical repair workshop. The equipment spread across the tables was unlike anything she had seen in the standard military inventory. These were clearly custom-built communication systems, designed for very specific and highly classified operations. Mike was waiting for her, along with 2 other men she didn't recognize. One wore Navy dress uniform with the insignia of a lieutenant, while the other was in civilian clothes but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of career military. "Sarah, I'd like you to meet Lieutenant James Rodriguez," Mike said, gesturing to the uniformed officer. "He's the project leader for this operation." Sarah shook hands with the lieutenant, noting his firm grip and direct gaze. There was something familiar about him, but she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Mike tells me you have some unique expertise with specialized communication equipment," Lieutenant Rodriguez said. "We could really use your help with these systems." Sarah approached the first piece of equipment, immediately recognizing the sophisticated design and custom modifications. This wasn't just military hardware. It was equipment designed for the most elite special operations units. "These are SEAL communication systems," she said without thinking, then immediately regretted revealing her knowledge so quickly. Lieutenant Rodriguez and the other man exchanged a quick glance. "How did you know that?" the lieutenant asked. Sarah realized she had made another mistake. Most people, even military technicians, wouldn't be able to identify specialized SEAL equipment so readily. Her recognition of these systems revealed more about her background than she had intended to share. "The design specifications are pretty distinctive," she said, trying to recover. "The waterproofing, the frequency range, the encryption modules. They're built for maritime operations." It was a reasonable explanation, but Sarah could see that Lieutenant Rodriguez wasn't entirely convinced. He studied her with the kind of analytical attention she remembered from intelligence briefings. "Let's see what you can do with this one," he said, pointing to a particularly complex communication system. "It came back from a mission in the Middle East and nobody has been able to get it working properly." Sarah began her examination, quickly identifying multiple problems with the system. The equipment had clearly been subjected to extreme conditions, with sand damage, impact trauma, and what looked like exposure to explosive forces. As she worked, her hands moved with practiced efficiency through diagnostic procedures that most technicians would need reference manuals to perform. She disconnected circuits, tested components, and traced signal paths with the kind of expertise that came from years of intensive training and field experience. "The main processor took a hard hit," she explained as she worked. "But the real problem is in the encryption module. It's been partially corrupted, which is why you're getting garbled transmissions." Lieutenant Rodriguez watched her work with growing attention. Something about her approach, her familiarity with the equipment, and her understanding of the operational context was triggering memories in his mind. "Have we met before?" he asked suddenly. Sarah looked up from her work, meeting his gaze directly. She could see recognition beginning to dawn in his eyes, and her heart began to race. "I don't think so," she said, but she knew it was too late. He was remembering something, putting pieces together. Lieutenant Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then his expression changed and Sarah knew he had figured it out. Afghanistan, he said quietly. Operation Neptune's Trident. You were the communications specialist who kept our channel open during that extraction mission near Kandahar. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. That mission was classified at the highest levels, and very few people knew the details of what had happened during those critical hours. I think you have me confused with someone else, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. No confusion, Lieutenant Rodriguez said firmly. You spent 18 hours under enemy fire, repairing and maintaining our communication systems while we waited for extraction. Your work saved the lives of 12 Navy SEALs and 2 Marine reconnaissance specialists. The other man in civilian clothes stepped forward, and Sarah realized he had been quietly observing the entire exchange. Sarah Martinez, formerly Staff Sergeant Martinez, attached to the 75th Ranger Regiment with specialized assignment to Joint Special Operations Communications, he said. Am I correct? Sarah knew there was no point in denying it any longer. Her carefully constructed civilian identity had been blown by her own expertise and the sharp memory of a SEAL lieutenant who had been there during one of the most dangerous missions of her military career. That was a long time ago, she said. Quietly, not that long, Lieutenant Rodriguez replied. And based on what I just watched you do with that equipment, your skills haven't diminished at all. Sarah looked around the room at the 3 men, all of whom were now regarding her with a new level of respect and interest. She had spent 3 years trying to leave her military past behind, but it had found her anyway. What exactly do you want from me? She asked. Lieutenant Rodriguez smiled. The same thing we needed from you in Afghanistan. Your expertise with communication systems in impossible situations. But this time, the mission is right here at home. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that had always accompanied her most challenging assignments. Despite her efforts to build a simple civilian life, she was being drawn back into the world of classified operations and high-stakes missions. As she looked at the sophisticated equipment surrounding her, she realized that her quiet days of repairing car stereos and home electronics were probably over. Lieutenant Rodriguez led Sarah to a secure briefing room, where she was asked to sign additional non-disclosure agreements. The paperwork reminded her of her military days, with multiple security classifications and warnings about the consequences of unauthorized disclosure. What we're about to show you is classified at the highest levels, the lieutenant explained. This project has direct implications for national security, and we need someone with your specific skills and clearance level. Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her chest. She had left the military partially because she had grown tired of the constant pressure and life-or-death stakes of classified work. But as she sat in the briefing room, she couldn't deny the excitement she felt at being needed for something important again. The civilian-dressed man, who introduced himself as Agent Kevin Walsh from the Defense Intelligence Agency, began the briefing with a series of photographs displayed on a large screen. 3 months ago, a terrorist cell operating in Southeast Asia acquired several pieces of advanced American communication equipment, Walsh explained. We believe they obtained these systems by attacking a classified supply convoy. The photographs showed sophisticated radio equipment that Sarah immediately recognized. These were the same type of specialized communication systems used by the most elite American special operations units. The problem, Lieutenant Rodriguez continued, is that these systems contain encryption protocols and frequency specifications that could compromise ongoing operations around the world. If the terrorists figure out how to properly operate this equipment, they could monitor our communications or even send false signals to our forces. Sarah studied the photographs carefully. She could see that the equipment had been damaged during the acquisition, probably during the attack on the convoy, but she could also see that someone had attempted repairs using improvised methods and incorrect components. Have they been successful in making the equipment operational? She asked. Agent Walsh shook his head. Not yet, but our intelligence suggests they're working with a technical expert who has been making progress. We estimate they might have functional systems within the next few weeks. What do you need me to do? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Lieutenant Rodriguez leaned forward. We need you to create a technical solution that will prevent these systems from being used effectively. even if the terrorists managed to complete their repairs. Sarah understood immediately. They wanted her to develop some kind of countermeasure or sabotage protocol that could be implemented through the communication networks themselves. You're talking about inserting code or hardware modifications that would disable the systems remotely, she said. Exactly, Walsh confirmed. But it has to be something that wouldn't affect our legitimate military systems, and it has to be undetectable to anyone examining the equipment. Sarah felt the familiar rush of a complex technical challenge. This was the kind of problem-solving that had drawn her to military communications work in the first place. But she also understood the implications of what they were asking. This would essentially be a form of cyber warfare, she said. You're asking me to create a weapon that could be deployed through communication systems. Lieutenant Rodriguez nodded. We understand the ethical complexity of what we're requesting. But the alternative might be compromised operations that could cost American lives. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing detailed intelligence, reports about the terrorist cell and their technical capabilities. The more she learned, the more she understood the urgency of the situation. These weren't amateur criminals. They were sophisticated operatives with access to technical expertise and funding. How much time do I have? She asked. 2 weeks, Walsh replied. Our intelligence suggests that's when they plan to deploy the equipment for a major operation. Sarah calculated the complexity of what they were asking. Developing an effective countermeasure would require her to understand not just the technical aspects of the communication systems, but also how the terrorist might attempt to use them. I'll need access to identical equipment for testing, she said, and I'll need a secure laboratory where I can work without interruption. Lieutenant Rodriguez smiled. Already arranged. We have a facility here on base that's been prepared specifically for this project. As the briefing concluded, Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Once again, she was being asked to use her skills in situations where failure could have deadly consequences. But as they led her to the secure laboratory, she couldn't suppress the excitement she felt at being challenged by such a complex problem. The equipment waiting for her was state-of-the-art, and she would have resources and support that most technicians could only dream of. The laboratory was impressive, with multiple workstations, testing equipment, and secure computer systems for analysis and development. Sarah realized that this project had been planned for some time, and they had been waiting for the right person to lead the technical work. One more thing, Lieutenant Rodriguez said as he prepared to leave her to begin work. This project is compartmentalized at the highest level. Even within this facility, only the people you met today know the complete scope of what you're working on. Sarah nodded, understanding the security protocols from her military experience. Compartmentalization was standard procedure for sensitive operations, but it also meant she would be working largely alone, with limited ability to consult with other experts. As she began examining the equipment in her new laboratory, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just a few weeks. She had gone from quietly repairing civilian electronics to working on a classified project that could affect national security, but as she powered up the first communication system and began her technical analysis, she felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her civilian life. This was work that mattered, work that could make a real difference in protecting American lives and interests. Sarah rolled up her sleeves and began the most challenging technical project of her career, knowing that success or failure could have consequences far beyond the secure laboratory where she now worked. Sarah had been working 18-hour days for over a week, surviving on coffee and the occasional meal brought to her laboratory by security personnel. The technical challenge was even more complex than she had initially expected, requiring her to essentially reverse engineer the terrorists' repair attempts while simultaneously developing countermeasures. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when she discovered a vulnerability in the encryption protocol that could be exploited remotely. By inserting specific code sequences into the communication network, she could cause the stolen equipment to malfunction in ways that would appear to be natural technical failures. She was hunched over her workbench, making final adjustments to the countermeasure program, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside her laboratory. It was late, well past normal duty hours, and most of the facility should have been empty except for security personnel. The door to her laboratory opened, and Sarah looked up to see Lieutenant Rodriguez entering, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was another Navy officer she didn't recognize, wearing the insignia of a full commander. Both men appeared tense and urgent. "Sarah, we need to talk," Lieutenant Rodriguez said. "This is Commander David Harrison. He's the overall operation commander for this project." Commander Harrison stepped forward, and Sarah immediately sensed the kind of authority that came from leading high-stakes military operations. His bearing and demeanor reminded her of the special operations officers she had worked with during her most dangerous assignments. "How close are you to completion?" Commander Harrison asked without preamble. Sarah glanced at her workstation where multiple pieces of equipment were connected in a complex testing configuration. "I've developed a working countermeasure, but I haven't completed all the testing protocols. I need at least 2 more days to verify that it won't interfere with legitimate military systems." Commander Harrison exchanged a look with Lieutenant Rodriguez. "We may not have 2 days. Our intelligence indicates that the terrorist cell is planning to deploy their equipment tomorrow night." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. She had been working under pressure before, but this was different. The compressed timeline meant she would have to implement her countermeasure without the thorough testing she had planned. "What changed?" she asked. Lieutenant Rodriguez answered. "Intercepted communications suggest they've overcome the technical problems we thought would delay them. They're planning to use the stolen equipment to coordinate a major attack." Sarah looked at her testing setup, calculating what she could accomplish in the remaining time. The countermeasure program was functional, but she hadn't been able to test it against all possible scenarios. "I can have it ready for deployment in 6 hours," she said, "but I can't guarantee it will work perfectly in all situations." Commander Harrison nodded grimly. "Understood. What do you need from us?" Sarah began disconnecting her test equipment and preparing the countermeasure program for deployment. "I'll need access to the military communication satellites that cover the target area. The countermeasure has to be inserted into the network at the highest level to be effective." "Already arranged," Commander Harrison replied. "We have satellite access scheduled for 400 hours. As Sarah worked to finalize her program, she felt the familiar combination of excitement and fear that came with high-stakes technical work. She had experienced this same feeling during her most dangerous military assignments, when her technical skills were all that stood between success and disaster. The next few hours passed in a blur of final programming, equipment preparation, and coordination with the satellite communication teams. Sarah found herself working alongside some of the most skilled military technicians in the country, all focused on implementing her countermeasure before the terrorists could use their stolen equipment. At 3:30 a.m., Sarah was in the Satellite Communication Center, watching as her countermeasure program was uploaded to the military communication network. The technology was impressive, allowing her to insert her code into communication satellites orbiting thousands of miles above the target area. "Program uploaded and active," announced the satellite technician. "All systems show green across the board." Commander Harrison turned to Sarah. "How will we know if it's working?" Sarah monitored her diagnostic systems, watching for the telltale signals that would indicate the terrorists were attempting to use their stolen equipment. "If they try to activate those systems, we should see immediate feedback. The countermeasure will cause them to malfunction in ways that should look like natural equipment failures." They waited in tense silence for nearly 2 hours. Then at 5:47 a.m., Sarah's monitoring equipment lit up with activity. "They're powering up the systems," she announced, multiple units coming online in the target area. Everyone in the communication center watched Sarah's displays as her countermeasure program engaged with the terrorist equipment. For several minutes, the readouts showed normal operation, and Sarah began to worry that her program wasn't working. Then, one by one, the terrorist communication systems began showing error codes and system failures. Within 10 minutes, all of the stolen equipment had shut down completely. "It worked," Sarah said quietly, then louder with growing confidence. "It worked. All their systems are down." Commander Harrison smiled for the first time since she had met him. "Outstanding work, Sarah. You may have just prevented a major terrorist attack." As the immediate crisis passed, Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was proud of her technical achievement and relieved that her countermeasure had worked as intended. But she also realized that this success would likely lead to more requests for her specialized skills. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached her as she began shutting down her monitoring equipment. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you accomplished here goes far beyond technical expertise. You've potentially saved lives and prevented a significant security breach." Sarah nodded. understanding the magnitude of what had just occurred. But as she prepared to leave the communications center, she couldn't help but wonder what this success would mean for her hopes of returning to a quiet civilian life. The mission was complete, but Sarah suspected that her involvement in classified operations was far from over. 3 days after the successful mission, Sarah was back in her small electronics repair shop, trying to return to the routine of civilian life. But everything felt different now. The car stereos and home electronics that had once provided her with peaceful, straightforward work now seemed almost trivial after the high-stakes project she had just completed. She was working on a simple radio repair when she heard the familiar chime of her shop door. Looking up, she was surprised to see Lieutenant Rodriguez entering, but he wasn't alone. Behind him was Commander Harrison and another man she didn't recognize, wearing dress navy blues with multiple ribbons and the insignia of a captain. "Sarah," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, "I'd like you to meet Captain Michael Stevens." The captain stepped forward with the bearing of someone accustomed to command at the highest levels. Sarah immediately recognized the kind of authority that suggested he was involved in very senior military operations. "Ms. Martinez," Captain Stevens said formally, "I understand congratulations are in order for your recent technical achievement." Sarah wiped her hands on a work rag and stood to face the 3 officers. Something about their formal manner and the fact that they had come to her civilian shop suggested this wasn't a casual visit. "Thank you, sir," she replied, falling back into military protocol despite her civilian status. Captain Stevens looked around her small shop, taking in the modest equipment and simple workspace. "It's interesting to find someone with your capabilities working in such a quiet environment." Sarah sensed there was more to this visit than a simple congratulations. "Is there something I can help you with?" Commander Harrison stepped forward. "Sarah, based on your recent work, we'd like to offer you a permanent position with a special military technical unit. Your skills are exactly what we need for ongoing operations." Sarah felt her heart sink. This was what she had been afraid of since the moment Lieutenant Rodriguez had recognized her in the communications building. Her success had made her valuable again, and valuable people in the military world didn't get to choose quiet civilian lives. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully, "but I'm happy with my current situation." Captain Stevens smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. "Ms. Martinez, with respect, your skills are too important to national security to be wasted on civilian electronics repair. We're prepared to offer you a commission as a warrant officer, with assignment to our most critical projects." Sarah understood the implicit pressure behind the offer. When the military decided they needed someone with specialized skills, they had ways of making it very difficult to refuse. "What if I'm not interested?" she asked. Lieutenant Rodriguez answered, "Sarah, you've already proven that you can't completely walk away from this work. When we needed you for the terrorist situation, you stepped up without hesitation." He was right, and Sarah knew it. Despite her efforts to build a simple civilian life, she had been drawn back into classified work almost immediately when the opportunity presented itself. "I need some time to think about it," she said. Captain Stevens checked his watch. "Of course. But I should mention that we have another situation developing that could benefit from your expertise. Time-sensitive, significant implications for operational security." Sarah realized they were offering her another mission even before she had agreed to the permanent position. It was a classic military recruiting technique. Demonstrate how much they needed her skills, then make it almost impossible to say no. "What kind of situation?" she heard herself asking. Commander Harrison opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder marked with security classifications. "Electronic warfare capabilities that have been detected in hostile nations. We need someone who understands both the technical and operational aspects of advanced communication systems." Despite herself, Sarah felt the familiar stirring of professional interest. The technical challenges of electronic warfare were exactly the kind of complex problems that had drawn her to military communications work in the first place. "I'd need to see more details before I could make any commitments," she said. "Captain." Stevens nodded approvingly. "Naturally. We can arrange a full briefing tomorrow if you're interested." As the 3 officers prepared to leave, Lieutenant Rodriguez paused at her workbench where the simple radio she had been repairing sat partially disassembled. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I know you came here looking for a peaceful life, but some people have skills that are too important to waste on simple tasks. What you did last week probably saved lives, maybe prevented a major attack. After they left, Sarah stood alone in her shop, looking around at the modest business she had built. She had always known that her military past might catch up with her eventually, but she had hoped for more time to establish her civilian identity. The truth was that Lieutenant Rodriguez was right. She couldn't completely walk away from the work, because when people needed her specialized skills for critical situations, she felt compelled to help. Sarah looked at the simple radio on her workbench, then at the business card Captain Stevens had left with his contact information. She realized she was facing a choice between the quiet life she had tried to build and the challenging, meaningful work that had defined her military career. As she locked up her shop that evening, Sarah knew that her decision was probably already made. The technical challenges, the opportunity to use her skills for important missions, and the sense of purpose she felt when working on critical projects were all pulling her back toward military service. Her quiet civilian life had been peaceful, but it had also felt incomplete. Perhaps it was time to acknowledge that some people were meant for more complex challenges, even if those challenges came with significant risks and responsibilities. The next morning, Sarah made her decision. She called Captain Stevens and accepted the briefing, knowing that once she learned the details of the new situation, she would probably be unable to walk away. When she arrived at the naval base, she was surprised to find herself in a large briefing room filled with senior officers from multiple branches of the military. This wasn't just another technical project. It was a major operation that required her specific expertise. As Captain Stevens began the briefing, Sarah realized that her skills had become critical to national security operations at the highest levels. The electronic warfare capabilities they had detected posed a serious threat to American military communications worldwide. But what surprised her most was the moment when Captain Stevens called for attention and announced that she would be receiving a commendation for her recent work on the terrorist communication equipment. As the room came to attention, Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped forward and delivered a formal salute. "Staff Sergeant Martinez," he said, using her former military rank, "your technical expertise and dedication to mission success exemplify the highest traditions of military service." The salute was more than just military protocol. It was recognition of her contribution to a successful operation and acknowledgement of her transition back into military service. As Sarah returned the salute, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders once again. But she also felt something she had been missing during her civilian years: the satisfaction of using her skills for work that truly mattered, surrounded by people who understood the importance of the mission. Sarah Martinez had tried to leave her military life behind, but in the end, her country needed her specialized skills too much to let her go. As she accepted her new position and prepared for the challenges ahead, she realized that some people are called to serve in ways that don't allow for simple, quiet lives. The small electronics repair shop would have to find a new owner. Sarah Martinez was back where she belonged, using her technical expertise to protect American lives and interests around the world. The salute from Lieutenant Rodriguez had been more than recognition. It had been a welcome home.